If you dare send one more dollar into this account, then from now on, don't call me your mother. That was the first sentence I heard when I answered the phone on a Monday morning, before I had even finished my first sip of coffee. I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the number on my phone screen, unable to understand how money I had been sending for nearly 2 years had suddenly turned into evidence used to humiliate me. I didn't argue or explain. I only knew that if I hung up that call today without understanding what was really happening, I would probably keep losing many more things, not just money. There's a saying I once heard somewhere: in a family, the person who sacrifices the most is often the one considered the least valuable. And if that's true, then what happens when that person suddenly stops? Before I continue this story, I want to ask you something very simple. Where are you listening to me right now? In the living room, in the car, or on a quiet evening when it's just you? If you've ever felt taken for granted in your own family, leave a comment, press like, and stay until the end of this video. Some stories, if you miss the ending, you will never understand the real cost of silence. I stood there for a few more seconds, the coffee machine rattling dryly behind me. Elaine Cross, my mother, had hung up before I could finish a single complete sentence. The small kitchen in my rented apartment was so quiet I could hear the air conditioner clicking on and off. I set my phone on the table, pulled out a chair, opened my laptop. I logged into my bank account. The transaction lines were neatly arranged, steady like a work schedule. Every month, the same. There was no place for a humiliating dollar. I zoomed in on each line, scrolling more slowly. In the memo column, a name appeared. Not my name. My heart skipped a beat. I switched tabs, opened a longer history, went back to the very first months. That name repeated itself, exactly the same. My phone buzzed. A message from Avery Sloan, my younger sister, short and cold. Don't make things more complicated. I'll talk to Mom. I stared at the words. Outside the window, the row of maple trees by the parking lot trembled lightly in the wind. I stood up, pulled the curtain aside, morning light spilling in and revealing the small scratches on the tabletop. Familiar marks of someone who lives carefully. I turned back to the screen. For the first time in 2 years, I read the account holder field closely. It wasn't me. I opened another window and looked up the account my mother had just cursed. The bank code matched. The name didn't. A small detail, but enough to piece everything together. The compliments I overheard through relatives, the stories about the responsible child that never used the right name, and this morning's call, reeking more of shame than anger. I closed the laptop, not rushed, not impulsive, just a quiet decision set down, like the cup of coffee I had let go cold. If this was the last dollar in their eyes, then I needed to know where it had gone and who was being credited as the provider. I picked up my phone again, not to call. I saved screenshots, and in that moment, I understood what made my throat go dry. The account my mother had just cursed had never been in my name. I placed the phone face down, opened the cabinet, grabbed a light jacket, and stepped out onto the narrow balcony. The parking lot below was starting to fill up, engine noise mixing with morning birds. I stood there for a while, not to think things through, but to let my body catch up. When I went back inside, I took a paper towel and wiped the cold coffee stain off the table. An old habit, cleaning up before doing anything else. That image pulled me back to dinners from years ago. The suburban kitchen, yellow light spilling onto a chipped dining table. Elaine sat at the head, Victor flipped through the newspaper, Avery talked about school. I stood up last, gathering dirty plates. Water ran into the sink, the soft clink of porcelain and metal. Behind my back, decisions were made: summer vacations, car repair money, extra classes for Avery. No one turned to ask if I was okay with it. I washed dishes until my hands went numb from the cold, then hung the towel neatly on its hook. Once I asked to switch work shifts to attend a scholarship interview. Elaine set her spoon down and said very gently, "You're grown. You understand." Avery was still young and needed opportunities. I nodded and texted the interview to ask for a reschedule. The message was never answered. That night, I was still the one who stood up first after dinner. In the years that followed, I got used to doing whatever was left. When Victor forgot to pay the electric bill, I handled it. When Avery needed money for books, I transferred it. I didn't think of it as sacrifice. It felt like a role assigned without a contract. Every time something came up, eyes turned to me, not to ask, but to be sure someone would take care of it. I remember a rainy evening when water flooded the porch. I rolled up my sleeves, cleared the drain, my shirt soaked through. Elaine stood in the doorway, handed me a towel, told me not to catch a cold. Warm enough words, but without the question, "Are you tired?" I dried my hands, folded the towel, hung it back in its place. Order returned quickly. Back in my current apartment, I opened the fridge, took out a bottle of water, and drank a long sip. The things I just remembered carried no shouting or slamming doors. They were quiet, like small numbers repeating on a statement. No one hated me. It was just that when responsibility was needed, my name was always at the top of the list. I set the bottle down, reopened my laptop, and organized the screenshots into a new folder. I gave it a simple name, nothing fancy. Outside, a car backed out of a parking spot, a short honk. I sat up straight and pulled my chair closer to the table. If I stepped out of this role, quietly, without argument, who would stand at the sink when dinner ended? And would that kitchen still be as tidy as before? That evening, Avery called me. Her voice was light, as if she were standing outside, wind passing through the receiver. She said money issues were stressing Mom out, relatives were asking questions, and every explanation just made things messier. "Maybe we should transfer together for convenience," Avery suggested. "Use a neutral name so there's less back and forth." I stood by the window, watching streetlights reflect on the glass. The suggestion sounded reasonable, tidy, very much Avery's style. Make the story look simpler. I asked what name. Avery laughed and mentioned a name that didn't point to anyone. Just a word for the bank to categorize. "I'll be listed as the one handling transactions. It's easier to explain," she added, as if that were the most obvious part of the plan. I twirled a pen in my hand, the tip tapping the table twice. On the other end, Avery added a few small details. Mom's work hours, Victor's appointment, an upcoming family gathering. Everything was said to prove this was just a convenient solution, nothing more. I opened my banking app. The screen lit up, asking for confirmation. For a brief moment, an old memory pushed in. Back then, I stood in the hallway at home, belongings stacked into two piles. Avery wanted the larger bedroom, so studying would be more comfortable. Elaine looked at me and said softly, "Let your sister have it." I carried my box of books into the smaller room and closed the door. No argument, just a nod. Back in the present, Avery kept talking. I didn't interrupt. My finger hovered over the screen, that familiar feeling returning, the feeling of keeping things calm by stepping aside. I inhaled and nodded, even though Avery couldn't see me. "Okay," I said, "let's do it that way." She exhaled in relief, thanked me quickly, and said she'd send the details right away. The message came a few minutes later. The account number, the transaction name, a short memo. I set my phone on the table and pulled my chair closer. On the wall, the clock ticked steadily. I entered the amount, the same as every month. The memo field showed that neutral name. Not mine, not Avery's. An empty word enough to cover everything. The screen asked for final confirmation. I reread the amount, glanced at the date and time. Nothing unusual, just a familiar action. My finger tapped confirm. The phone vibrated softly, signaling a successful transfer. I set it face down and stood up to pour water. In that moment, I didn't know I had just erased my own name from the story, light as folding a kitchen towel, hanging it on its hook, and leaving the room before anyone turned around. The months after that passed in a very steady rhythm. So steady I had to check my phone calendar to remember what day it was. During the day, I worked in an office. At night, I took extra shifts at a convenience store near my place. Harsh fluorescent lights, the smell of pre-brewed coffee, the constant opening and closing of automatic doors. I folded uniforms, counted change, closed out registers. By the time I got home, it was late. I reheated a simple meal, washed the single plate, then sat at the kitchen table and opened my banking app. Once a month, the familiar action repeated. I gradually cut small expenses, no more eating lunch out, canceled my streaming subscription, walked instead of calling rides. Those things were light as dust, but together they were enough to keep the transfer steady. I didn't add any notes, just the right amount, on the right day. On the other side, everything seemed fine. One Sunday afternoon, I stopped by the grocery store to buy milk. Walking past the bread aisle, I heard my name mentioned, not by family, but by a distant relative. They talked about Elaine, about the child who supports the family, about how lucky it was to have someone so responsible. No one said my name. The story passed like a piece of good news, enough for people to nod along. I put the milk in my basket, waited at checkout, watching the numbers flash on the screen. Those compliments reached me indirectly, through a screenshot of a message, through a half-told phone call. I heard them and left them alone. On my statements, the numbers stayed neatly aligned. $36,000 a year. A silent summary line, no asterisk, no name attached. At the same time, Avery started changing in ways that were easy to notice. She bought more clothes, switched phones, talked about weekend gatherings. Her bills didn't pass through my hands, but her stories did. I nodded when she spoke, didn't ask much. At the convenience store, I lingered longer by the register, waiting for the last customer to leave so I could turn off the lights. One rainy night, I stopped at an ATM on the way home. The screen reflected my tired face, raindrops clinging to my jacket. I inserted my card and entered my code. The balance appeared, lower than I wanted, but exactly what I had calculated. My finger rested on the confirm key. The ATM screen glowed, clearly showing the $3,000 I planned to send. I looked at the word confirm one last time, then slowly pressed cancel. The machine clicked as it returned my card. It was the freest sound I had ever heard. For the first time, I didn't withdraw money for my family. I stood in the rain, feeling the cold soak into my skin while my chest felt strangely light. Maybe all of us have a moment like that, a moment of waking up, when we realize we've been carrying the load for so long that we forgot we can get tired too. If you're listening to these words in some quiet corner and see yourself in my story, let me know where you are. I'm here and I'm listening. I slipped the card into my wallet, pulled my hood down, and walked into the rain. The feeling wasn't relief and it wasn't fear. It was like setting a heavy object down after carrying it for too long. Your arms still numb, but your back a little straighter. On the way home, I didn't turn on music. I just listened to the rain tapping steadily on the car roof and let the numbers rest where they belonged. That month passed quickly. No notifications, no explanations. I did just one thing. On the familiar date, I didn't open the banking app. That evening, I cooked a simple meal, washed the dishes, and turned off the lights earlier than usual. The next morning, my phone started buzzing. Messages came first, one after another, then calls. I let the phone vibrate on the table, the short rings cutting into the air like knocks. When I answered, Elaine's voice was taut like a stretched string. She asked where the money was, said bills were due, said relatives were waiting. I heard enough to know a link had fallen out of place. I said I was busy and would call back. I didn't. The next call was from Victor. He didn't beat around the bush, just listed things that needed to be done and unnecessary consequences. I stood in the hallway looking at the shoes lined up neatly by the door. Outside, the wind blew hard, branches knocking against the railing. I ended the call with a short, polite sentence. Avery called in the afternoon. Her voice was different. Higher, faster. She said I was ruining everything, said Mom was worried, said arrangements couldn't fall apart just because of 1 month. I listened without interrupting. She stopped, waiting for a reaction. I said I would call Mom. That evening, I called. Elaine answered immediately, as if she had been waiting. I didn't argue. I asked just one question, slow and clear. Who do you think that money was coming from? On the other end, there was no immediate answer. I heard breathing, the scrape of a chair, a soft metallic sound against a table. Time stretched long enough for me to hear the clock in my own kitchen shift its rhythm. Some families aren't afraid of losing money. They're afraid of losing the one who carries it. Elaine said Avery's name, like it was obvious. I didn't correct her. I didn't offer proof. I just repeated the question, shorter this time. She stopped mid-thought. The silence stretched, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much she didn't want to name. The phone grew warm in my hand. I switched hands and leaned against the wall. Outside the window, streetlights flicked on, yellow light spreading over the rain-soaked parking lot. I heard a very soft sigh and then nothing. Elaine didn't hang up. She didn't continue either. I waited, not to win, but to see where the answer would land when there was no longer a detour. On the other end, the silence lasted too long. long enough for me to understand that, in that moment, the role I had held for so long had just stepped out of its old place, and long enough for me to know that from here on, nothing could go back to the way it was. 2 days later, Avery came to see me. She didn't warn me. I had just gotten home when I saw her standing in the hallway, clutching her bag, eyes red from lack of sleep. She spoke quickly, as if afraid I might close the door. She said Mom had asked the bank, asked Victor, even asked the relative who still kept the old records. She said there was no way around it anymore. I opened the door and let her in, poured 2 glasses of water and set them on the table. I didn't ask anything. Avery sat up straight, her hands clasped together. She said the money had always been mine, said every month, said the amount, even said that neutral name. She spoke in quick breaths, like she was reciting a list she'd memorized. When she stopped, the room was so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator humming. I nodded and didn't cut her off. She lowered her head like she'd just finished something hard. Victor called right after. He didn't ask if I was okay. He talked about dignity, about how the whole family was being looked at differently now, about how this shouldn't have happened. His voice kept rising when he mentioned relatives, not because the money had been hidden, but because the story had been flipped. I stood by the table watching my shadow on the wood floor. I said I'd been sending it regularly, said I had statements. He went silent for a few seconds, then said, "We'll see." The next call was from Elaine. She didn't scold me. She asked why I hadn't said something sooner. The question was light, but she set it on the table like a lid. I listened and didn't answer right away. I set my phone down and opened my laptop. The files were already sitting in the folder. I pulled my chair closer, arranged the statements by month, zoomed in on the numbers, checked one last time. We met that afternoon. No meal, just the kitchen table and chairs pulled out unevenly. I set my laptop on the table and turned the screen toward them. Victor stood. Elaine sat. Avery leaned back against the wall. I didn't explain at length. I opened each page and scrolled slowly so they could see the date, the amount, the memo. When I was done, I closed the laptop. "I don't need anyone to believe me anymore," I said, my voice even. The sentence landed on the table, not heavy, but final. Victor turned his face away. Elaine stared at the empty space in front of her, lips pressed tight. She didn't apologize. She repeated the same question, smaller this time. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I didn't answer. I stood up, picked up my laptop, pushed the chair back in. Avery looked at me like she wanted to say something, then didn't. The truth was sitting in the middle of the room, not needing more words. What was left was even clearer. They knew. They had just chosen to believe what was convenient for them. I stepped outside and closed the door gently. On the porch, the afternoon wind moved through, carrying the damp smell of wet leaves. I stood there for a moment, then left, leaving the kitchen behind with numbers that no longer had anywhere to hide. The moment the door shut, I left behind those humiliating numbers and faces that couldn't look straight at me. People say family is where you're supposed to forgive, but some people also say boundaries are what keep love from turning into exploitation. Do you think my decision to give the position back to my younger sister at this point was right or wrong? Leave an emoji that shows how you feel, so I know I'm not walking alone on this road back to myself. The next morning, I worked through the list I'd written the night before. No music, no phone beside me. I logged into my bank, created a new account, confirmed every security layer. A completion message appeared on the screen. I moved all my savings into it, double-checked the old balance down to the minimum. The cursor sat still for a few seconds before I logged out. Next, I canceled the recurring transfers. A confirmation line popped up, clean, emotionless. I called my mobile carrier and changed my emergency contact number. The representative asked for a reason. I said personal. The call ended in 3 minutes. I wrote the new number on a piece of paper, folded it, and put it in a drawer. The old phone was powered off, placed face up on the table. No vibration, no blinking light. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator opening and shutting. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole. Elaine stood outside, her coat unbuttoned, a bag in her hand. I opened the door. She stepped in fast, voice sharp, saying I was selfish, saying I'd embarrassed the family, saying everything had been fine before I broke it. Victor wasn't with her. Avery wasn't either. The room suddenly felt smaller under the weight of her words. Elaine took another step forward and pointed toward the table, asking where the money was. I didn't sit down. I stayed by the door, one hand on the light switch. She kept talking, bringing up the years, the times I'd been helped. I listened without cutting in. When she paused to breathe, I said one short sentence loud enough to be heard. Starting today, I'm not providing financial support anymore. She froze for a beat, then raised her voice. I turned and put my hand on the doorknob. Elaine called me ungrateful. I pulled the door open and stepped aside. The hallway wind rushed in, carrying dust and old rain. She looked at me like she was waiting for me to soften. There wasn't any. I lifted my hand in a small gesture. Elaine backed out, added a few unfinished words. I didn't respond. When she stepped outside, I closed the door. For the first time in my life, I locked it while I was still standing inside. The click of the lock turning was clear, decisive. I leaned my back against the door and let out a long breath. Outside, there was a light knock, then nothing. No more bell, no more calling. I walked into the kitchen and set my keys on the table. Metal met wood with a soft sound, then went still. No buzzing, no light. I turned off the living room light, leaving a dim glow in the kitchen. The apartment returned to its own rhythm. I stood there for a while, looking at the keys lying still, like a period placed exactly where it belonged. The weeks after that weren't as loud as I expected. No more doorbell, no more floods of messages. News reached me in more indirect ways. Through someone I ran into at the grocery store, through a bit of conversation I overheard while standing in line at the post office. The family had to tighten spending. Bills came earlier than expected, a few payments ran late. Stories that used to be covered with laughter were now told in lower voices. Avery postponed her plan to move. She resold a few items that were still new. One afternoon, she texted asking if I was holding onto the spare car key, an out-of-place question, like it was meant for someone else. I didn't answer right away. I set my phone down, washed my hands, dried them, and only then typed one short word, no. Some families aren't afraid of losing money. They're afraid of losing the one who carries it. That line came back at unexpected times. Like a distant train horn, I drove to work and watched the roadside billboards change with the seasons. In the parking lot, I looked at old and new cars mixed together, thinking about the things that had once been treated as obvious. At night, I came home, cooked for one, cleaned up neatly. Everything ran smoothly in a way that felt suspicious. On a night with light rain, I pulled in under the gas station canopy. White light shone down onto the wet ground. I remembered my first paycheck. Thin paper and the smell of fresh ink. I'd stood at the counter to transfer money, reading every line carefully, sending it home with a short memo. Back then, the happiness didn't come from what I had left. It came from the feeling that I'd done the right thing. The image flashed through like a short clip, then went dark. In the present, I paid for gas, took the receipt, folded it, and slipped it into my pocket. On the way home, the radio played the evening news, the anchor's voice steady. I caught half of it, the other half drifted away with the rain. Heavy and light feelings took turns. Sometimes my chest tightened, like I'd just closed a door without knowing where the key was. Then it settled, making room for a strange kind of quiet. One morning, I got a call from an unknown number. A man introduced himself briefly and asked about a guarantee. I said he had the wrong person. The call ended politely. I stood in the kitchen, watching steam rise from the kettle, waiting for the click that signals it's boiling. The small apartment warmed up. I sat at the table, opened my work planner, and marked a few tasks for the week. There was no item on the list about going back. Not out of resentment, but because going back would mean taking the old role back. I closed the notebook and set my pen down. Outside, the rain had stopped completely. The street in front of my building reflected the lights, clean. I stood up, pulled the curtain open, let the light in, and chose to keep moving forward, slowly, without looking back. Nearly a year later, I saw Elaine again. No plan. I was standing in line at the pharmacy near my neighborhood when I saw her at another counter, holding a prescription slip, her hair grayer than before. We noticed each other at the same time. She gave a very small nod. I returned a similar nod. No rushed steps, no calling names, just two people waiting for their turn. Outside the pharmacy, we both paused under the awning to get out of the sun. Elaine said the weather had been unpredictable this year. I said it had. She looked at my bag like she wanted to say something about how hard things were at home, then stopped when she saw my eyes. I didn't ask if she was short on anything. I only asked, "Did you get your medicine? The sun's about to get really harsh." The words flowed lightly, like water slipping through fingers. When there was a gap, we left it alone. She said Avery had switched to part-time work, that old plans were on hold. I listened and nodded. Elaine said the house had been quieter lately. I looked at the parking lot, the faded paint lines under the sun. No apology, no blaming. Each of us stood where we stood, not stepping into the other's space. A gust of wind lifted the receipt in her hand. I reached out and held it down for her. Elaine thanked me, took it back, and folded it carefully. That small gesture was enough to end the conversation. We parted with a polite goodbye, like old acquaintances running into each other after a long time. On the drive home, I stopped at a red light and watched people pass. The sense of loss came slowly, not sharp-edged, not losing a family, but losing the old picture I had of that family. The price of that was real, clear, but it didn't pull me backward. I still got to work on time, still cooked dinner for one, still placed my keys into a small bowl on the table. A new habit, steady. That night, I reorganized a drawer and found the piece of paper with my old phone number. The ink faded. I picked it up, read it once, then folded it back. I didn't tear it in a rush. I set it aside like setting down a book I'd finished reading. Outside the window, the streetlights turned on, tree shadows stretching long across the sidewalk. I made tea and sat in the chair by the window. In the silence, I listened to the wall clock change its rhythm. Everything was moving forward in its own way. I didn't know whether there would ever be a day I stepped back into the old role. The answer wasn't there yet, and this time I allowed it to stay that way, like an ellipsis, not closed, not forced open too soon. After that, my life didn't have a loud turning point. No winning moment. Just mornings when I woke up at the time I wanted, made coffee the way I liked, and went to work without having to think about who I still owed something to that day. I no longer asked permission to exist inside my own day. Everything happened quietly, but solid. I didn't look back. This victory didn't come with applause, only a strange kind of quiet in my small kitchen. Before, every decision I made had to pass through an invisible question: is this good for the family? Now that question was gone. In its place were small, ordinary choices. Staying 10 more minutes when it rains, taking a new project, refusing a call at the wrong time. Those choices didn't make me look stronger to anyone else, but they were enough for me to stand straight in the mirror each morning. Some nights, sadness still came by. It didn't crash in, it didn't claw. It was just a thin, empty space when I remembered old meals, laughter I used to believe belonged to me. That sadness stayed small and neat, without dragging anger behind it. I let it sit, like a keepsake placed where it belongs, not hidden, not carried everywhere. I learned that justice sometimes isn't being recognized. It's being chosen. Choosing not to keep playing a role that has worn you down. Choosing to save your energy for things that can nourish you long term. Choosing yourself, not because you're selfish, but because if you don't, there's nothing left to give in a healthy way. The story you just heard is fictional, inspired by very real-life situations and familiar human experiences. The content was assisted by AI and edited by humans, with the hope of offering a perspective to reflect on, not to encourage or promote any specific action. Everyone has their own circumstances, pace, and choices. If there's a small gift I can leave you through this story, it's the right to set boundaries without feeling guilty. A boundary isn't a wall to push people away. It's a line so you don't lose yourself in silence. Before we close, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you right now? At home, on the road, or in a rare, quiet moment just for yourself? If this story touched you in any way, leave a comment, press like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for staying until the end. Every view is meaningful companionship, and I truly appreciate it.